We talked to the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, about the UK's borders amid reports the government could tighten rules for arrivals from abroad. It's something Labour's Shadow Home Secretary, Nick Thomas-Symonds, has some opinions on. And he joins us now from South Wales. Good to see you. What should happen when it comes to border control, do you think?
Well, good morning, Stephen, and obviously please do pass my best wishes to Sophie for a swift recovery. Nobody could say that the situation at our borders is satisfactory or that there is sufficient protection in place for our people against the different strains that could be coming from around the world. So we need now to put additional protections in place. We do need that effective border testing regime, and we also need an effective quarantining regime, which we've not had. The government did not introduce a comprehensive quarantining regime until June last year. This government was an international outlier. If you go back to May last year, it was only the UK, Iran, Luxembourg, and the US Virgin Islands that had no travel protections in place. It was too slow. It was put into place in June. It isn't effective at the moment. We need that additional quarantining protection in place. I would support, for example, the introduction of the use of hotels. But above all, we need a comprehensive system and plan from the government and stop moving from one chaotic situation to another.
Well, hotels, I mean, it's been talked about before and other countries are doing it. Are you saying that everyone who arrives in the UK should be put into a hotel and forcibly quarantined for, I don't know, what would it be, 10 days or so?
It does need to be a comprehensive system. Clearly, you would have to have a very different system for hauliers, for lorries crossing the English Channel. That would have to be obviously very different. But in terms of travellers arriving in the United Kingdom, you would need to have that comprehensive system. And let me just say why this is so important, because the government introduced a quarantining system far too slowly in June of last year. The government's own figures show that between June of last year and September, around about 2 million people had their passenger locator forms, their details, if you like, spot checked by Border Force at the border. Only around 3% of those were successfully contacted to ensure they were quarantining. Now, that just isn't good enough. It isn't effective. The government hasn't had a grip on this situation throughout. We desperately need them to get a grip and have that comprehensive plan in place. I mean, even the meeting tomorrow and Tuesday that they're talking about having should have happened on Thursday. Even that is too slow. This can't continue. They need to have that meeting.
Forgive me, it's all well and good to talk about having a comprehensive system in place. And on the surface, a lot of people would agree with it. But it's all about the nuts and bolts, isn't it? It's about what that system actually is and how you implement it. Back to that dreaded word of logistics, which is going to be problematic with this. So what exactly would you do if you were in government?
Well, the Labour government would have taken a very different approach to the setup of the quarantining system in the first place. The government's isolation assurance service decided to outsource this system to a company called Citl. The government's own target of contacting 20% of those coming into the United Kingdom hasn't been met. I mean, I indicated the figures in my last answer. It's nowhere near that. So we would actually have used a far more effective system, wouldn't have outsourced it in the way that the government has, and we would have acted more quickly. I've been raising the issue of border protections from last April, in June, in September, time and time again. I've been raising this issue, and the government has been.
But forgive me. I mean, we are where we are today on the 24th of January. So what would you do moving forward? I mean, it's no good deciding what you would have done. It's what would you do from here on in?
Well, I think the government does now need to introduce quarantining hotels, as I've already indicated. The government also then needs to have that effective testing system in place and needs to avoid the situation that we've seen over the weekend of those crowds and crowds of people at Heathrow Airport. And that's happening because the government does not have this strategy in place. And I think by putting in place that system, around hotels. We've seen it work well in Australia, for example. Then that would be a step forward. But I come back to the central point. We can't keep moving chaotically from one situation to another. We need that comprehensive system. It needs to be put in place.
What about the restrictions that we've got in place at the moment? Because there's a lot of concern about the new variant, concern that it may be, and it is a may at the moment, but it may be more deadly. We certainly know it's more transmissible. The current lockdown rules are looser a little bit than they were in the summer. Does that need to change?
Well, look, we called for a lockdown. The government then for England introduced that lockdown, which they, in my view, had to do. Could we do more? Yes, of course we could do more. We've already been talking throughout this interview about the situation at the border, and I've indicated that that absolutely needs to be tightened up. But there's also an issue around messaging and the government getting its messaging right. You know, we had last summer, for example, the so-called back to work message, trying to get people back into the office. And yet we're seeing only in the last couple of days in the government's own agencies, take the DVLA in Swansea here in Wales, from where I'm speaking to you, where we've had an outbreak in a workplace. So we need not only to make sure we get this borders issue right, which is absolutely vital, particularly for the strains that are coming from abroad, but government messaging needs to be more consistent and effective as well.
Can we just turn our attention to the State of the Union? Because you'll have seen the Sunday Times and that YouGov poll today. Look, if, as expected, the SNP does as well in the elections in May as they're talking about, they're on about possibly getting a total of 70 seats, which I think it's more than half of the number of seats in the Scottish Parliament. Would that give them a mandate for a second referendum? And would Labour support that, even if it didn't have Westminster approval?
I think it would be a profound mistake to take the election of May in Scotland, or indeed any other part of the United Kingdom, for granted. And if any party is taking votes for granted, then they clearly shouldn't be doing that. We have a very clear position going into those elections in Scotland against the idea of a second independence referendum. And it is frustrating at the moment, I have to say, because at the moment we are in the midst of this pandemic. It is this pandemic and working together across the United Kingdom to try to do our best to save life that should be the absolute focus at the moment, not this constitutional issue.
OK, Nick Thomas-Symonds, good to talk to you. Thank you.